Well, Hi everyone. Welcome to another session of Sybeco. I'm Farzaneh Najafi, and we are hosting Elom Amematsro today to present his work. Uh, Elom received his Bachelor's of Science in Math and Physics from the University of Utah. There, he worked in Sophie Caron's lab on olfactory perception and memory in Drosophila. Then he went to complete his PhD at Columbia University, working with Larry Abbott and Mark Churchland on nonlinear dynamical systems analysis and theoretical models of learning and motor control. He is now a Kempner Research Fellow at Harvard University doing theoretical work, and his research broadly aims to uncover the neural principles that enable animals to rapidly adapt and solve novel tasks. Welcome, Elom. Thanks for accepting our invitation. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I'm very excited to share this work with you guys. So as for us in the sense, like my main interest is trying to understand the neural principles underlying our ability to learn multiple skills, especially simultaneously. Right, this is a challenging computational problem that's been difficult for us to solve on the machine learning side, but it seems like the brain has a very easy time solving these kinds of problems. And one of the ways the brain is able to solve this is that it can leverage prior learning to make new learning much simpler, right? And it can do this using various structures. For example, one of them is compositionality. And one of the best examples of compositionality is in the motor system, right? For example, gymnasts have to learn many complicated gymnastics routines, but this is made simpler because they learn individual gymnastics skills such as backflips or cat leaps or even handsprings. And they're able to, given these sort of primitive gymnastic skills, they're able to recombine these in a bunch of different ways to create novel routines, right? So we have a lot of behavioral evidence supporting this kind of compositionality, and we have good theoretical justifications for why you would want this kind of compositionality. What we don't really have yet is an understanding of how the brain actually achieves compositional motor control. Right. So for these kinds of questions where we don't really have a good understanding of how the brain achieves it yet, we figured that a good way to develop these kinds of theories is to look at the solutions found by neural networks, right? In particular, recurrent neural networks, which have been shown to be pretty good models of cortex from various tasks. And if you train recurrent neural networks or any other kind of model on multitask settings, there's a bunch of solutions that they come up with, right? But the solution that we're most interested in is the one I'm about to describe. So sometimes when you train recurrent neural networks to solve multiple tasks, or in our case, multiple skills, what it learns is to isolate each individual task or skill into distinct regions of neural state space, right? And the reason that it does this is because recurrent neural networks solve these tasks by learning task-specific flow fields or dynamics, right? And isolating these tasks into distinct regions of state space allows the network to benefit from disparate local flow fields or local dynamics while also mitigating interference between these skills or tasks across time. And so we like this view or sort of this framework, right? Because it gives us a very simple idea of sort of like how we can get multitask behavior in a single recurrent neural network, but also gives us things like compositionality for free, right? For example, if you imagine like what you want to do is perhaps go perform a split leap and then go into a handspring and then go into a backflip, or in this case, a cat leap. Then what this theory says is that the way that you can get this kind of compositionality for free is that you can move through these distinct regions of state space in the exact order that you want, right? And so along with providing sort of simple mechanistic models, right, this also gives us a bunch of very testable neural predictions about if the brain really is operating in this regime, what are the things that we'd expect to see? Right. So, for example, the simplest prediction of this is that you would expect to see that different skills should be isolated into their own distinct regions of state space. Right. A corollary of this is that you'd also expect that the axes of variation within any individual skill should be different as you move across skills. Right. In other words, you should expect that each skills is sort of executed by skill-specific subspaces, right? So this framework, so in summary so far, this framework gives us a nice mechanistic model for how we can get compositionality and multitaskability in the brain, and it also gives us a set of easy neural predictions. What we want to know then is sort of like, how can we test this in the brain? To do so, we sort of need a task that has the ability to elicit multiple skills, but is also simple enough behaviorally for us to understand what's going on. So to do this, what we did is we leveraged a previous task that we came up with, which is the Pac-Man task. For those of you not familiar with this task, it's very simple, right? So the goal for the monkey is to control this Pac-Man icon in yellow. And the way that the monkey controls the Pac-Man icon is by pushing on a load sensor, right? So the harder the monkey pushes on this load sensor, the higher the Pac-Man icon rises, right? The goal for the monkey is to intercept as many of these scrolling red dots as possible. So importantly for this task, the monkey's arm is fixed, right? So the monkey's arm isn't moving. And what that means is that in the limit of infinite accuracy, we can control the exact force profiles that the monkey generates by changing this trajectory of dots. And what we're going to take advantage of is this feature to basically get the monkey to produce a bunch of different force profiles that we think should elicit different subskills or different skills and neural activity, and then be able to record how the brain performs these different skills. To give you more of an intuitive understanding of how this task works, here's a quick video. On top, you're going to see the screen that the monkey sees as he's performing this task, and on the bottom is just our screen that we see as we're recording muscle activity. All right, so the two things I want you to notice is that so those quick bursts that you hear are sort of just muscle activity. But what I want you to realize is that the monkey's force or the height of that icon is closely related to the activity of the muscles. And then the second thing I want to show is sort of like the diversity of force profiles that the monkey actually generates, right? So as you saw in that video, the monkeys get very good at this task, right? So in blue is a target force profile that we want the monkey to produce. And then overlaid on that in red is the mean force profile that the monkey produces and the standard deviation, right? So the monkeys get very good at performing the force profiles we want, and their behavior is very stereotyped across trials. Now, as you also saw in the video, we asked these monkeys to produce a variety of force profiles. These force profiles can be roughly divided into 4 categories, ranging to static forces that the monkeys need to produce, slowly changing ramps, fast changing ramps, and then slow and fast signs, right? So both monkeys were trained to produce 12 or 11 conditions or 11 force profiles, and I'll use the term condition or force profile interchangeably. The second monkey wasn't able to do the 3 hertz condition. He got very mad when we showed him this one, so we kind of just took it out of the test set. But on the screen, these profiles don't look very scary. But as you saw in the video, some of these profiles come really, really quickly, right? And so what that means is that what we have here is the diversity of sort of the temporal properties of these profiles. And this is important because we know that there are significant delays in the motor system. So what that means is that for something like a static condition, I can rely on a closed loop control policy or something, where all I need to do is monitor my immediate error and then figure out how to close that immediate error. Now, if I'm trying to do one of these faster sinusoids, that strategy won't hold anymore because the lags from when I produce an error to when I notice that error is too big, which means that for some of these faster conditions, what I'm likely going to be using are more proactive strategies, which require me to plan a movement ahead of time and then execute that later. Right, so to show you an example of this, we can look at single trial behavior that the monkey produces.
Question, Elon. So I just want to make sure I follow this. So the task for the monkey is to move this up and down. So it's a one-dimensional movement.
Yeah.
But the force profiles look different. And what you're showing are like 1, 2, 3, 5 example categories of how they do this. Like they may hold it in one position, then move up. So that's the static. Another like in 3 positions. Or they may do slow ramps. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So this is one-dimensional, and then all we're changing is the trajectory of the leftward scrolling dots.
Right. Yeah. And then you're measuring this force through EMG.
So we're measuring it 2 ways. One is through EMG, and then the other is through the load sensor.
Okay.
That the monkey's actually pushing up. For this task, those 2 are highly correlated. Yeah.
Okay. And then these are, I just want to make sure, these are different trials, like that all of them were like rewarded. So they solve the same task using different strategies.
Yeah, so that's the idea, right? That you have, so we have, so for monkey C, he has 12 conditions, and he knows that there are these 12 conditions, and he's going to see them repeatedly. And then this is just the mean activity or the mean force that he produces on those conditions. And then same for monkey I.
Okay, I guess then I don't know what's the condition.
So right now, I see, can you see my mouse or no?
Your
So
mouse, I can,
each,
but it's not moving.
okay, so
Maybe it
for,
would be just like a quick clarification, Farzaneh, is that
Yeah.
these traces are also the dot traces that the monkey was trying to follow. So what's rewarded or not is whether the monkey was following
Okay,
the trajectory.
I see. Okay, so it's not the same thing solved in different ways. It's actually different versions of the task.
yeah, but the goal for all of these is always to match your force to the target force. And
Yeah.
you're doing it through the same manipulation. But yeah,
Okay. Right, thanks.
yeah, no problem. Okay, cool. So we can also try to understand sort of like the argument from before is that because we have these different temporal properties of these conditions, that we should also be able to see different behavioral strategies used, right? That for slow conditions, we should sort of see that the monkeys are relying more on closed loop feedback control policies. And then for these faster conditions, that the monkeys are relying on open loop or sort of like proactive or planning strategies. So one way we can see this is by looking at just the errors that the monkeys are experiencing on individual trials. So in blue, I'm just showing you the average force profile that the monkey produces for what I'm going to call the quarter hertz condition. Right. And then in red, I'm going to show you the force profile that the monkey's producing on a single trial. On the bottom, I'm just going to subtract those two for you. And so what you can think of that is that that's sort of the error that the monkey is experiencing. Right. So what this shows is that early on, the monkey is below where he normally is and experiences a negative error. Right. And then recognizes that and sort of overshoots and corrects for that error. And then we can also see this sort of happening across time. And this kind of ringing that you see in the error is characteristic of a delayed feedback control process. Now, I want to contrast this to what happens when the monkey is asked to produce now a 2 hertz condition, which is one of our faster conditions. So the first thing I want to bring up is that when the monkey starts performing this task or for this given trial, he starts with an error, and this error persists, right? So the important part is that this error lasts for about a second, right? And we know that as we compare this to the quarter hertz condition, the monkey has enough time to correct for this error. And these errors, so I guess the way that monkeys are rewarded for this task is by reducing their mean squared error to the target, where it's like these errors cause them to lose reward. But we still see that he's not correcting that. And I'm going to argue that the reason that they're not correcting that is because they know that this 2 hertz component is coming and they're using that time to plan for the 2 hertz component. Right. So when the 2 hertz component comes on and ends, we see that that original offset persists and has gotten a bit worse. But now at the end of this trial, the monkey sort of knows that there's no longer a 2 hertz component coming up and sort of uses that to now close the original error. Right. So what we see here are two examples of two different behavioral strategies. One in the quarter hertz, where the monkeys seem to be monitoring their online error and then using that to close that error, as you'd expect from a closed loop feedback control process. And then a more open loop strategy where the monkeys seem to have a template of the behavior that they want to match and then sort of execute those behaviors open loop. But these are just two single trial examples. What we really want to know is, are there systematic differences in the way that these control policies or behaviors are elicited across conditions? Right. So the way we can do that is by trying to fit.
Two questions. Okay, could you go back? So I'm confused by this topic of force here because I thought what the monkey is doing is to match where this target is moving. So it's about just trajectory matching. So where is the force coming from? So is it that they have to do two tasks at the same time?
No, so the way they control the height of the icon
Yeah.
is through force. So force and the icon height are matched.
It's not by moving something up and down?
Yes, but the thing that they're moving up and down is by force. Or it's like they move that icon up by applying force to a sensor. So
Okay.
the higher the force, the higher the icon rises. Right? It's
Okay.
like this task is about matching your force trajectory to the actual force trajectory or to the target force trajectory.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And then another
And
question.
Elom, you'd consider this isometric, right? Like the
Yeah.
arm isn't really moving; they're just imparting force.
Exactly. Yeah. So
Okay,
it's
okay, that's helpful. Right. So they're not actually moving something through force, they move it up and down.
yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then this topic of open loop and closed loop, I also want to make sure I follow this. So you call the one on the left side closed loop, meaning that they use error to adjust their force?
Yeah, exactly.
And then the one on the right, you say open loop because they don't really care about the error, but they kind of force. Why do you call that open loop? Open loop for me is if things are just separate, like you show something, you do something else. You're like, yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm
I
not.
guess like open loop here is kind of like the monkeys know the conditions that they're being asked. So you can imagine that an open loop strategy is one that recognizes I'm being asked to produce a 2 Hertz condition. I have some memory of like what that 2 Hertz condition is, and then I just execute that. Right? Like as I'm executing that, I'm likely going to be off and I'm going to experience some errors, but I'm going to ignore those errors and just continue to execute what I thought I should do from my memory. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Tim, do you have a question?
No, I was just going to comment on that because that's what I was looking at when I was reading the papers, the difference between open and closed. And I guess these are different. You're saying open and closed as far as it's a different control strategy, right? When it's a slower oscillation or like a slow ramp on the left, and the monkey has time to employ strategy where they're correcting for the error. Whereas when it's a higher frequency oscillation, they have to say, okay, this matches what I've learned. I have a prediction of it, and then I'm going to oscillate at this frequency, but I'm not correcting for error during the actual movement itself.
Exactly. And the reason is because the lag between like the lag between the error and when you cause the error is too large for like these high frequency things for that to be usable. But yeah, that's like the idea.
We have also a question from Chris in chat that says, is it a pattern generation versus feedback control?
Yeah. I think you can roughly, yeah.
Okay. And feel free, guys, to just unmute and ask.
Any more questions or should I move on?
For now, we're good. Yeah, I don't see any
Okay.
question.
Cool. So then this next part is really just trying to quantify this across all of our behavioral data. And all we're going to do is try to fit models to try to predict how the monkeys are going to respond to certain errors or just certain conditions, right? So importantly, what we're going to do is we're going to fit 2 kinds of models using 2 features. The first feature is going to be the error history, right? So this is important for sort of like if the monkey's behavior is well approximated by a closed loop feedback process, then the error history is all the information you need. And then the other part that we're going to add to the model is a template, right? So this template is going to be condition specific, and it's supposed to capture this idea that the monkeys have a memory of which condition they're performing, and then they'll have a memory that of what that force profile is, and they execute that model. Right, so we're going to fit both of these models on some subset of our training data or some subset of the monkey's behavior. And then the way we're going to try to infer whether the monkeys are using more of an open loop or more of a closed loop strategy is by comparing the ratios of the performance of these 2 models on a generalization set. Right, so again, the idea here is that if the model that has the error and the template performs just as well as the model that only has the error, then what that tells us is that the monkey's behavior is pretty well described by closed loop control policy. Whereas if the model with the error and template performs much better than the model with error alone, that this open loop template is contributing a sizable portion to the monkey's behavior. Right, so we can do this first for the quarter hertz condition, which is that first slow one that I showed you where we saw the ringing. And what this analysis tells us is that behavior is pretty well described by just a purely control policy or purely error-driven model.
Elom,
Right.
question. There is something important that I guess we need for this. Are these presented in blocks, these different
No.
conditions? So
It's
they're
completely
randomized.
randomized. Yeah.
Okay. And there's no cue whatsoever, so they just sleep.
Yeah, but there's no cue, but they're experts. So like they can pretty quickly infer which of these conditions they're in.
But it's like as they go, they see. There's nothing
Yeah,
from
exactly.
the beginning. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. And then what this analysis then says is that for the 2 Hertz condition, which is the second condition that I showed you, where we saw this persistent offset, that this template seems to be contributing a lot to behavior. So we can do this for all of our conditions, right? And what we get is a sort of split that looks a lot like you'd imagine. For these slower conditions, so the static, slow ramps, quarter sign, behavior is pretty well described just by purely control policy or purely closed loop based model, right? And then for these faster conditions, behavior seems to be better described by a model that has both the error history and this template information. Right. So what this suggests is that there's at least 2 strategies that the monkeys are using, one that's closed loop and one that's open loop. Right now, the reason I say that it suggests that there's at least 2 is because each of these conditions that we think use the templates use different templates, right? And what that means is that, as someone suggested earlier, that if we think of these templates as pattern generation, that you need a different pattern generation for each of these, right? So you can think of this as having almost 6 or 7 different strategies. Okay. So this is it for the behavior so far. But I want to dive into like one important thing. So one of the important choices in this task is that we think that muscle activity in this task should be very easy to understand. And that's going to enable us to do some neural analysis on it, right? So we're just going to verify that really quickly, right? And so what we can do is just take all the forces that the monkeys provide, and then we can, because the monkey's arm is fixed, or in other words, this is an isometric task, what this lets us do is not only record EMG, but also record individual motor unit activity, right? So what we can look at is sort of the individual spiking neurons or spiking activity that contributes to these motor units. And we can do this for a bunch of different muscles. We're going to focus on the deltoids because those are the muscles that are most important for this task, right? So all I'm showing you here is some spike rasters from the anterior deltoid and the lateral deltoid. And all I want you to take away here is that spiking activity for these motor units is very correlated with force, right? So importantly, you can see that there's differences within a muscle between the motor units, right? Like none of these motor units look exactly the same. And there's some differences across the muscles, right? So like the anterior deltoid and the lateral deltoid don't look exactly the same. But by and large, you can basically describe both of their activity as being highly correlated with the force. We can do this not only for these muscles or for these few motor units here, right? We have about 140 motor units, and we can look at just the PCA of these populations, right? And what you get is, again, what you saw, what I said before, right? Like you have some muscle differences, right? So the muscles are used slightly differently within these conditions, but each of the muscles seem to be highly correlated with the force, as we'd expect. Right. And this is going to be important when we contrast this to what happens in the cortical activity. Right?
This is the time course of the top PC?
This one, yeah. But the top PC accounts for like 85% of the variance.
Okay.
So you can think of that as like, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So we record from M1 and we use neural pixels, and we have about 1,000 neurons per monkey, right? But the important part is that when we look at the cortical activity, what we get in contrast to what we got from the motor units is that each cortical neurons seems to be very different from all the other cortical neurons, right? So on top, you have a cortical neuron that looks a lot like force, right? So this is a neuron that whose activity seems to mimic the motor units, right? But we specifically chose this neuron, and most neurons actually seem to be doing something completely unrelated to force, right?
So are these, which layer are you?
Say again?
Which layer? Which cortical layer?
Because of our recording, we can't really say which layer we're in because of the folds.
But okay, so this is motor court M1?
Oh, so this is M1, but we don't know which
so
layer.
they're not necessarily corticostriatal. Sorry, I don't mean striatal, it's spinal.
Cortical motor, yeah. We're not sure
Okay.
about that, yeah.
Right.
Okay. So what we can do is try to quantify the degree to which this.
There's a question.
Oh, go for it.
So I guess it's condition 9 or 10 through 12, which are the template-based oscillatory type motions, and then the ones prior to that are all of your closed loop.
Almost. So 5 and 7 are also the
Right, but they're still distinctly different from an oscillatory. Like I would think you would have some template activity in 5 and 7, but then also some closed loop error control in those as well. Kind of a mixture between the closed loop and open loop type strategies, or a blend between those. And when I'm looking at these, like, because you note in the paper that we don't necessarily see neural activity that corresponds to the force profile, correct?
Or so I guess I'd clarify that a bit. So in the neural activity, you can very accurately predict that profile, the force profile, but you don't have neurons that just purely reflect that. Or the degree to which neural activity reflects force is very small, I think is
right. Well, you can predict it from the population, though, but not necessarily an individual neuron.
Exactly.
Because the population strongly encodes the force profile, but you do see a diverse range of activity across the individual neurons. Exactly. And so, but when I'm looking at these, though, like in whether 9 or 10 through 12, as well as 5 and 7, where you have the more strongly template-based activity, it does seem to have a strong correlation to the force profile, less so in the closed loop type approach, is where, like, looking at just neuron 1 through 4, that's where you see the differences is in the closed loop type signals, right? Or it doesn't necessarily correspond to the force profile in those closed loop conditions.
Right. So I guess, like, I think is what you're asking, that like you may not have neurons that reflect force broadly across like all the conditions, but if you restrict it to like just the closed loop conditions or just the open loop.
Right, because that's where it looks like you have more of a difference between where the neural activity correlates strongly to the force profile is in the closed loop conditions. And I would think that makes sense, right? Because you have something that's trying to minimize the error. So you have different error correction occurring in different segments.
Just to be sure we're on the same page, there's no force profile shown on the slide right now, right? These are just
no, but you can use the first neuron's activity almost as like the force profile.
Okay.
Right. But then to answer, oh, sorry, go for it.
Oh, no, so that is an example of a neuron whose activity across conditions seems to correlate well with force. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And then to answer the other question. So it's true that if you try to limit this analysis to like a single condition or like a small set of conditions, you can find that neurons' activity sort of like the correlation of that increases relative to their correlation across like all conditions, as you'd expect. But even within that, it's still a small population. The number of neurons whose activity correlates with force or even derivative of force, even when you restrict to a smaller condition set, is still small.
Okay, yeah, that's something I guess that would be difficult. It's difficult to tell because we only get 4 neurons in that particular figure. But all right, thanks.
Oh yeah, but I think it's a good question. But yeah, but it's not like you have neurons that are forced like for open loop things and then neurons that are forced like for closed loop things. It just seems like broadly you don't have neurons that are forced that are just a pure reflection of force. But,
all right.
And then I think the questions kind of hinted at this analysis, but all we're going to do right now is take the spiking activity of each of the neurons, and then we're just going to fit a GLM to it to try to see how well we can predict spiking activity from force, error, and then the derivatives of those two. And we chose those 4 features because if you're doing some kind of like control policy or like feedback thing, those are kind of the 4 features that you'd care the most about. Right, so as a control, we first do this for the motor units. And as you'd expect, you can predict motor unit spike in activity very well using these four features. Importantly, only force seems to matter for predicting motor unit activity, which makes sense, right? And then if you do this for the cortical neurons, then you get that the vast majority of spiking activity is poorly predicted by these four features, right? And then the other analysis, go for it. Someone has a question. Was there a question?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't
Okay.
see it. Yeah.
Cool. Then the other analysis we can do, of course, is ask, we're in primary motor cortex. This task is primarily about force. So we know that force should be in the population response somewhere. What we want to know is to what degree is that population, to what degree is that feature in the population response. So to do this, what we can do is ridge regression, right? And we're going to use ridge regression to try to find decoding dimensions in the population activity that both accurately predict force. But then as we sweep the ridge parameter, what we ask is that the decoding dimensions also align strongly with the axis of variation within the neural data itself, right? So what this gives us is kind of a Pareto front of how well we can decode force and then how much of the neural activity's variance is captured by that decode, right? And so when we do this for both populations, so our motor units and then our cortical neurons, and we get two very different stories. The first is that for the motor units, you can get decoding dimensions that both accurately predict force, right? So like it's about a little over 0.8, right? But are also able to capture a large fraction of the motor unit population variance, right? In contrast, for the cortical neurons, and you have decoding dimensions that highly predict force, but only capture a fraction of the total cortical population variance, right? And then this is it as a bar plot. But again, so all of this that I've just showed you is kind of a necessary condition for the two things that we primarily care about testing to be true, right? Like if all of our neurons just reflected force, then this is a really bad task to study skill compositionality in. Right, so with all that out of the way, we can sort of start testing our first real predictions. The first being that if this task really is being achieved by multiple skills or subskills, that each of them should be isolated into distinct regions of state space. Right, so the way that we're going to do that is pretty simple, right? We'll just take neural activity across all of our conditions and then sort of just get a baseline activity, right? So we'll just take the mean of neural activity across all times that the monkeys are performing the Pac-Man task. And that's going to be this gray dot here, right? And then what we can ask is when the monkey's performing the low static condition, where is the mean of that activity, right? So like the way we do this is you just take neural activity only from the low static conditions, and then we look at the mean of that, right? And then we can just plot that in the same space, right? And then we can do this for all of our conditions, right? And so the pattern that you should see here is that for each of these conditions, what seems to be happening is that neural activity initially starts in this gray region and then moves to a distinct location of state space corresponding to which condition that the monkey is performing. Or importantly, this space also has some geometry to it, right? So you can see that on the x-axis is primarily about whether you're in an open loop or a closed loop versus open loop strategy. And then the y-axis is more about whether you're increasing or decreasing. Now, this is important because from the RNN work, what we predict is that the degree to which you want two skills or two tasks separated is related to how different the dynamics you want those two to be, right? So what that means is that the neural distance should be sort of proportional to how different to some notion of like skill distance, right? So we can test this directly by just asking how well we can predict the neural distance between any two conditions based on three features, right? So the first is just going to be a behavioral feature, which is how different the average force across these two conditions are. And then the other two features are going to be what we're going to call skill differences, right? The first is going to be whether your control policy says whether your behavior is on average increasing. So if I'm on average increasing the force or am I average decreasing the force. And then the second skill feature is just going to be the generalization error that we get when we infer a control policy for one condition and then test it on a second condition, right? So the takeaway is that these features can predict the neural distance very well, right? But then we can do this for the motor units too, and they can also predict neural distance for motor units also very well. But the important thing is that for the motor units, the only feature that really contributes is the force distance, right? So the only thing that predicts how different conditions are in motor unit space is how different their average force is, which again makes sense. So this is really more of a sanity check. But if we do this for the cortical neurons, what we get is that the feature that contributes the most is going to be this policy generalization, right? So this is how different your control policies are, right? So this makes sense, right? And again, it's sort of consistent with our theory that if this is really about subskill separation and sort of needing to separate disparate dynamics from each other, then you'd want something that sort of correlates with skill differences, right? Like if I have two skills where the local dynamics of those don't need to be very different, then I also don't need to separate them very much, right? But what you'd expect is
Elon,
that
one question, clarification.
Go
So
ahead.
if you could go back, so that yeah, the skill difference one, that's about the reactive versus proactive. That's the open closed loop.
Yeah, so this is if I take the F model that I got from one condition and then I ask it to predict the responses in a different condition, what's the error of that? So that's about open versus closed.
And then the difference too, that's about whether they're increasing or decreasing force.
Exactly. Mhm.
Any idea why motor cortex would not much care about that?
Why it would or
If
why
you
it
show the
wouldn't?
next figure here, seemed like the motor cortex had the lowest contribution for the direction. Is that not a level of surprise?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I don't have a good intuition for that one.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. Okay. So a prediction is like if the previous analysis was really telling us something about skills and not something about behavior. Right? Because I guess a confound in the previous thing is that for all of our conditions, as the skills change, the behavior also changes. Right? It's like if all we're capturing in these centroid spaces or the previous analysis is just how different behavior is, what you'd expect is that those axes along which the centers are separated should also vary strongly within a condition. Whereas if what those axes are really capturing is some notion of skills or some notion of control policies, it doesn't really make sense for control policies or skills to change wildly within any given condition. Right? So what we can test directly is using the previous analysis, we can find these dimensions along which the centers of different conditions are well separated, and then ask to what degree do those centers also explain, to those dimensions, also explain variance within any individual condition, right? And so to do that, we're just going to look at the variance explained by these centroid PCs within a condition, right? So this is important where it's like we're only looking at whether these dimensions are reused within a single condition. Okay. So for the motor units, what we find is that by and large, those centroid PCs also capture variance within any given condition. Whereas with the cortical neurons, what we get is that those centroid PCs do not, I guess, only weakly capture activity within a condition. So what that means is that we have a signal that varies strongly across conditions, but only varies very weakly within a condition, right? So this kind of rules out any confound where those centroid dimensions are also being captured by things like force or derivative of force. Okay. But now, importantly, there are interesting violations to this, right? And we can see one of them here if we look closely. So what we find is that this quarter hertz condition falls right in between where the slow increasing ramp center is and where the slow decreasing ramp center is. Right? And there's sort of two ways that this could happen. One of them is that if the quarter hertz sign really is its own skill, then it's sort of its own skill that lives in that centroid position. The second way is if this quarter hertz sign actually spends half of its time in the slow increasing ramp portion, and then the other half of its time in the slow decreasing ramp portion. And what I'm going to show is that that's basically what happens. And this sort of gets us into the second prediction that this makes, which is that different skills should be executed in specific skills related subspaces. Right. And this is the main one that sort of relates to ideas of compositionality. Right. So again, so our framework gives us a prediction for how compositionality should be achieved, which is that if I want to compose two skills or three skills together, what I'm going to do is sort of move through different regions of state space and some specific time, right? And what that also means is that I'm going to be able to, that we can see these reuses or sort of compositions of primitive skills by looking at the subspaces of neural activity. So what we can do is create what we're going to call some reference subspaces. And these reference subspaces will correspond to what we think are going to be some pure putative subskills, right? So for example, the slow increasing ramp, slow decreasing ramp, and then some of the sinusoids, right? And then for any new condition, we can just look at how much neural activity occupies these subspaces as a function of time. Right, so to give you intuition for how this works, we can do this just for the quarter hertz sign, which again, the previous analysis shows is right in between the slow increasing ramp and the slow decreasing ramp. And we might expect that this sign is actually composed of increasing skill and then a decreasing skill. Right, so what we can look first is sort of the reuse of the 3 hertz subspace over time during this, and we find that the 3 hertz subspace isn't really reused. And then same thing for the 2 hertz subspace, and then same for the 1 hertz subspace, right? But what we do find is that if we look at neural activity in the decreasing, in the slow decreasing ramp subspace, then we see that neural activity reoccupies this space during the end half of the quarter hertz sign. We also find that it occupies a slowly increasing subspace during the first half of this, right? So what this suggests is that the subspaces for the quarter hertz sign switches about halfway through the quarter hertz, right? So what we can also track is which of the previously defined centers neural activity is closest to as a function of time, right? So
Question, Elom. So
Yeah.
how did you find the slow increasing and decreasing ramp subspaces?
Yeah, so here all we're doing is we're taking neural activity only within the slow increasing ramp, and then we fit PCA to that, and then that gives us some subspace. So I guess the way we find the subspace for the slow increasing or slow decreasing ramp is by running PCA only on that condition. Does that answer your question?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
But then is it not a little bit cyclical that you found it, because it does go up and down? So you're finding the PC for this going up, and then you find the PCs for the 3 hertz and the other condition. So is it not,
So I think
did not
maybe
expected that won't do a good job here?
no. And then I think the next one will show why that's right. So we can also do this for the chirp condition, right? And I guess to like answer your question, like the first analysis you can do is if what you're saying is true, in that like any time the behavior goes up and down, you expect a reuse of the slow increasing, like sort of like this increasing and decreasing skills, then what you should see is a reuse of the slow decreasing ramp subspace that we found earlier and the slow increasing ramp subspace that we found earlier for this chirp condition. And what we find is that that's not true, right? That even though the behavior is going up and down as you'd expect, that these subspaces aren't actually reoccupied. But what is reoccupied is the subspace for the 1 hertz sign, the 2 hertz sign, and then the 3 hertz sign in an order that you'd expect, right? And then you also have the same behavior where as the neural activity is transitioning between these subspaces, its location in neural state space also moves across these. So does that answer your question for us?
Yeah,
Yep.
this is pretty convincing. Yeah.
Then, so I guess one of the weaknesses with this is that we have to define what the reference subspaces are or what these putative subskills are, right? So what we wanted to do instead is see
And
if we
then,
can do
sorry,
that.
one
Yeah.
more question. So the reason we get 1 hertz, 2 hertz, and 3 hertz is so that's kind of like the frequency decomposition of that?
Exactly. The chirp is a continuous transition from a 0 frequency to a 3 hertz sign at the end. So then the next thing is just about trying to do this exact analysis, but completely unsupervised. And so what we're going to do is basically to do this, we just take all of the neural activity we have, and then we're going to run sparse component analysis, which is just PCA with a small L1 penalty, right? And importantly, we're not going to give it any information about which conditions we think should relate to each other. All we're going to ask is that the factors that it finds should be sparse in time, And when we do this, we get factors that broadly reflect what we saw in the previous analysis. Right? For example, we find two factors that seem to be related to activity in the slow conditions. Another factor that seems to be related to activity in the medium conditions, one related to activity in the fast conditions, one related to activity in the static conditions, right? Broadly reflecting what we saw previously, right? But we also see structure here, which is that we see these two factors that become active for the slow increasing ramp, respectively in the slow decreasing ramp. And we see that these factors are reused as we expected in the quarter hertz sign in exactly the same order that we found before. Right now, importantly, I'm showing just two factors here, but there's actually a lot. There's many factors that are reused temporally exactly in the same order that you'd expect. Right? Right. And then same for this chirp condition, which again, the previous analysis showed us that for the chirp, neural activity seems to be transitioning from the subspace related to 1, 2, and 3 hertz in this orderly manner. We find the exact same thing in a completely unsupervised fashion. And again, there's many of these subspaces, or there's many of these factors corresponding to this, right?
Here's a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in this part, when you've as my question here is more as the mathematical process you're using to find these, because I would think if you take and you isolate some of these, you could say, and you do a separate PCA on something that's a blend of subskills, that yes, you could find this explained variance across these subskills, but which would be different from, are you getting these factors from, say, you look at the slow ramp, or you look at a 1 hertz or a 2 hertz and a 3 hertz, that's where you get those factors. Then you apply it to the combinations and you find the same thing.
No. The factors are found using dimensionality reduction on all of the data at once.
Okay, well, yeah, that's what I'm asking is so that you know that those factors correspond when you have a blend of skill subsets. You know those correspond to the simpler, more pure set of it's a slow increase, it's a slow decrease, or it's a 1 hertz, a 2 hertz, or a 3 hertz. Like, for example, how you see those combined in the chirp. It's across the entire set, so it's the same set of mathematics producing those. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Cool. Was there another question? I can't see the chat.
Yeah, sorry. Hey, Elom, this work is awesome as always. Yeah, I was just curious. It from looking at this, it doesn't. It kind of appears like one subskill ramps up and then it ramps down, and then another one ramps up and ramps down. Do you think there are times in which two are simultaneously active?
Yeah, I think actually, I think someone brought up earlier that for like these step functions, like the fast ramps, you would expect them to have like a component that's related to the closed loop component and then also like the open loop component, right? So like that's like one, I guess, two clear times where you'd expect a lot of these subspaces to be like simultaneously active. And that's sort of like what you see here. So I guess for those not familiar, so these fast ramps are effectively just step functions. It's like from a Fourier-based way, like you basically expect that to have components in the slow frequencies and in the high frequencies. And what you see is that for both of these step functions, that you see neural activity that occupies the medium, fast, and sort of like slow subspaces all at once, which I think answers your question, Shadlen. Yep.
Got it.
Cool.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, and then the important part there here is that even though for these step functions, you have all these subspaces active simultaneously, you still see differences based on whether you're doing an increasing fast step or a decreasing fast step, right? So again, all this really just recapitulates what we found in the first analysis using PCA. But here, the reason we like this more is like we just don't have to provide any labels about what we think the actual subskills are. And a good example of this is like whether you think these fast ramps are actually different subskills, are different from the slow, medium, and fast subskills, or they're just a combination of that. Like we didn't want to have to like answer that. But yeah. Okay. So in summary, question.
No, just saying that's cool.
Okay, cool. Okay. So certainly so far, what we've shown is that I guess both of our predictions have kind of been validated, right? Which is that first, these skills should be in distinct regions of that state space, and these skills should be using different skill-specific subspaces, right? But sort of if what we're arguing is true, and like the way that motor cortex works is as this big subskill repertoire, then what you'd predict is that neural activity in motor cortex should be more related to the subskill similarity than the motor output. And what that means for us specifically is because the way we've been defining subskills here is related to the control policy. What that means is that if we can design a situation where the control policy is very different, but the direct motor output of that control policy is the same, right? Then what we'd expect is that neural activity in motor cortex should reflect the fact that the control policy is different, rather than the fact that the behavioral output is different, right? So to test this, then what we basically added is two versions of the task, right? So the first version is what we call the inverted Pac-Man version, right? So the way the original Pac-Man task worked is that the icon starts at the bottom and the monkey pushes to make that icon go up. So what we can do instead is make the icon start at the top and then make the monkey push to make that icon go down, right? So what that means is that because of flip symmetry, that even that if we give a mirror a flipped target profile to the monkey, we can actually trick him into producing the exact same force profile in both conditions. Okay. Now, the other task that we have the monkeys perform is what we're going to call the gain change Pac-Man. Now, this is just very similar to the original Pac-Man task. All that's going to change is that we're going to change the gain between the force that the monkey provides or pushes on and the amount of pixels that the icon actually rises. Right? Specifically, we're going to reduce that so that the monkey now has to push harder to make that icon go up higher. Right? And so what that means is that the monkey is going to be producing much higher forces in one context versus the other, right? So now to see
One
why.
question, Elom.
Go for it.
So all
Yeah.
of the data that you're analyzing, the neural data, is after monkeys expert
Or
the
expert.
task.
Yeah. Yeah,
Do
exactly.
you have anything from the process of because supposedly these subspaces are learned. They don't start being there. So they start first following the three hairs and then they learn that no, I better do it like for the in the open loop way.
Yeah, I think our intuition is that like all of these subspaces result from learning. Like when they start initially, like you don't have these differences. But the reason we don't record during learning is just because it's very hard, right? Like their behavior is changing a lot, and all of those recordings take like hours to do. So I think it was if we had, if I could go back in time, like we would have done it during learning, but I think it was just a risky experiment to do before.
And these are acute recordings, I suppose.
Say that again?
Are these acute recordings or chronic?
Yeah, these are acute.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think like that would be an ideal experiment in the future. But yeah. Okay. But again, so the prediction is that neural activity should reflect differences in control policy or sort of like these subskills rather than direct changes in the motor output, right? So to see why we think these two tasks should have different implications for like how the control policy changes, we can just look directly at the monkey's behavior, right? So for the original Pac-Man task, all you need to know to understand the control policy is to look at how the monkey is going to respond in the future to various visual errors, right? So on the far left side, if the monkey finds himself below the target, then he should just push more to make him increase. And then on the far right side, if the monkey finds himself above the target, he should just decrease his force to make it go down. And so you can see this in the monkey's behavior exactly. Now, in the inverted version of this task, this relationship flips exactly, right? So now if the monkey finds himself above the target, he should actually push more to make it go down, and then vice versa. Now, here I'm showing you this at a specific time point in the future. What we can do is basically just take the slope of these two lines, right? And then look at this as a function of the delay or the time in the future, right? And what this gives us is what we're going to call sort of a behavioral feedback kernel, right? So for the original task, we get this kind of kernel. For the flip task, we get the exact opposite kernel, right? So again, matches our intuition. For the original versus flipped versus inverted task, we have equal and opposite feedback functions. Now, if we do the same thing for the gain change experiment that I talked about, what we get is feedback kernels that look just like scaled versions of each other, right? And the intuition here is that the inverted feedback kernel is going to require much bigger changes in subskills than just a gain change in those feedbacks, right? So what we can do then is for each of these contexts, we're going to record neural activity across all of the contexts and then just document how much does neural activity change across these contexts, right? So we're going to quantify how much neural activity changes as neural dissimilarity. Then I'm just going to show you the statistics of that, right? So across all of these contexts, what we find is that the neural activity changes the most in across the subskills. And here, cross subskills just corresponds to the inverted versus original Pac-Man task rather than across the gain change experiments. To give you some more intuition about what this metric is quantifying, I can just show you what the median neurons for each of these look like. Right, so for the across the two gains, which again, across the two gains corresponds to very big changes in the exact force output that the monkeys are producing, yet we see very similar neural activity across them. Right, in contrast to that, to the two across subskills, we know that the force across these two, or the force profiles across these two, are closely matched, yet we see neural activity is very different. Right, and again, here I'm just showing you the median of those two. We can directly quantify the degree to which the neural activity changes versus the degree to which the behavior changes versus via neural dissimilarity versus a sort of behavioral dissimilarity metric, right? And again, what we find is exactly what you'd predict if our core hypothesis is true, which is that if neural activity is really more about these subskill differences than it is about the direct behavioral output, then I can design situations in which the behavior is very different, yet neural activity is very similar. So again, this is just a core prediction that we have. So in summary, so far, what we've shown you is that neural activity in motor cortex seems to be very consistent with this subskill hypothesis, which comes from a long lineage of work in recurrent neural networks and trying to understand how recurrent neural networks can solve multiple tasks, right? A core prediction of this framework is that different subskills should be performed in different regions of that neural state space, and that should correspond with us seeing sort of different subspaces used, right? So with that, I'd like to thank all of my co-authors, especially Eric, who helped me with all the recordings, and Najja, who designed the original Pac-Man task, and everyone in the Churchland and Abbott lab. And with that, I'll take any more questions if there are any.
Thank you, Elom. That was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions? And we are right in time, despite all the questions.
Yeah, I'd like to say, like, for one, Elom, that's a really nice experiment paper and results. Rarely do I see across a lot of papers does anything come out that's very elegant and convincing and makes sense so easily. So I really like it. Something else I would like to see, though, is, the paper focuses very heavily on M1. And so sort of a seek and ye shall find, or you find what you're looking for. So I would wonder, it would be nice to see, like, because you can't really posit. It's like, okay, well, how much of this is input into M1 versus how much of this is locally trained across the skill subsets or control policies. So it would be nice to see, because a lot of this data is very similar to what we see in cerebellum and PPC. So, it would be nice to say, okay, well, what can we say about this with the thalamocortical loop? And I didn't know if you guys have any plans on further modifying that experiment. I would say do the exact same thing, but it would be good to have a simultaneous recording in cerebellum and or PPC to see, okay, how much of this is originating in which regions, and how much of this is coordination between the regions, and where do you see lead and lag of these type of decision variable policy recognition and selection and coordination schemes here.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think like I spent a lot of time trying to convince some of the other grad students to look into like multi-area recordings across like supplemental remote area, parietal cortex, and like basal ganglia. So I think like
Exactly.
that's like the exact kind of experiment that I would want to do. But yeah, I guess I'd have to convince other people to do that at this point. But I think it's like the right direction to push after.
I would also be curious too, is like, when you do the gain change versus the inverted task to try to separate, okay, well, how much neural activity differentiation do we see? We see it mostly in this, um, where the control policy differs more so. We see less neural activity change when it's simply a gain shift. But I would be curious, maybe it's too simple of a gain shift to see the difference there. I mean, maybe give it a more complex relationship, x squared, or some sort of a polynomial on the gain, right?
Yeah.
That requires a bit more complex retraining than just a multiplication or fraction of the force.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess like for the reason we expected just like a pure gain shift to not change the subskill very much is because so one of the original findings is that the force decoding axis is poorly aligned with like the major axis of variation, which is really useful for like this kind of like gain change experiment because if the angle's already if like the principal angle is already close to 90, then a small change from like 80 to 78 has a big change on the amount of force that you're outputting without having to change your neural activity very much. So what we find is that for this gain change, then all you really need is a small misalignment, a small change in the amount of misalignment between the force decoding dimension and the principal axes of variations. But that completely changes if we do something that's squared or a nonlinear gain change.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I would be curious to see what occurs in that condition, but thanks.
So it's 1:05. Do we have any more questions? All right. Thanks a lot, Elom.
All right, thank you for the
Have a
invitation.
great day.
Thank you for see you guys.
Sure.